Hello, Jason.
Hello, Alessia.
So we are going to talk about online reputation management with knowledge graphs on Google. And
Right.
most people don't understand how these properly work together. They think that most of the negative SEO and negative brand SERPs results are cleared away with proper backlinks or managing some stuff around that. And what can you say about that? So is there any application with what you do to help people manage their reputation online better?
Right. Well, my approach is very much proactive brand SERP and knowledge panel management. The idea is that if you organize and control what Google is showing when people Google your brand name or your personal name, you really can easily control the reputation. The reputation for me is an added bonus. So I don't come from an online reputation management perspective. But what I think is now happening is that once you control your brand SERP and or your knowledge panel, you can control what appears, what doesn't appear. You can basically tell Google, educate Google what you want it to show your audience about you. And so there is reputation management, but it doesn't come from a negative point of view. It isn't saying this is bad, I need to get rid of the bad stuff. It's saying I want this to represent me correctly, positively, accurately, and convincingly. Now, when you've got something negative on the brand SERP, traditionally what ORM, online reputation management experts, will do is create new content to try to drown it. That can be helpful, but I would argue it isn't ideal. The problem with new content, of course, is that new content won't have any historical value in Google's eyes. It won't have backlinks. So that's an awful lot of work that you need to do to put into getting that to rank. But if you look at page 2 of your brand SERP, you can find all the stuff that Google is ranking, but it's not convinced 100% that it's really representative of you. All you then need to do is convince Google that content, that great content on page 2, represents you, and that Google can push it up onto page 1, which would then push the negative content down and off page 1 onto page 2. I call that leapfrogging. It's taking great content that's underneath that bad result, promoting it, doing some SEO for others. Do the SEO for somebody else. Push their page up onto your brand SERP, pushing that bad content off. Solves your problem. And it's much more effective, much more efficient, much more honest than creating brand new content, bespoke content. And also, when you create bespoke content specifically for that reason, your audience isn't necessarily interested. Google will tend to figure that out for itself because it wants to show your audience things that are valuable and helpful to them when they are searching your brand name.
So what do you think about Wikipedia? Would creating a page in a Wikipedia help with managing your reputation online, or is it sometimes not necessary and sometimes even misleading?
Right, well, Wikipedia, that actually is a really nice segue into the right rail, which is the knowledge panel. First of all, Wikipedia will tend to rank page 1 when there is a Wikipedia article about the entity, which means that if that Wikipedia article is negative or inaccurate in any way, it's going to rank, and it's very difficult to get rid of. So you're taking a risk. If you go down the Wikipedia route, you're allowing the Wikipedia editors to say what they want about you. You don't have direct control. So you're taking a risk if you go down that route. Now, what a lot of people say is if I create a Wikipedia article, I will get a knowledge panel. But the problem with that is that you get a knowledge panel on the terms of Wikipedia. Whatever Wikipedia says is going to be taken to be truth, which means you lack control. Now, today, about 50% of knowledge panels are driven by Wikipedia. That means 50% aren't. That means you don't need Wikipedia. And Rand Fishkin actually had his Wikipedia article deleted because he said, I don't want some Wikipedian to be controlling my brand message, controlling the truth about me on my brand SERP. And I think Rand Fishkin was right. I don't think Wikipedia is a great way to go forwards. Now, talking about reputation management, I have a client who, in their knowledge panel, it actually says, what is their annual revenue? And the fact is wrong. And they say we want to get rid of it. The solution to that, of course, is what Google has taken the information from a third-party source. That third-party source has got it wrong. In this case, it's not Wikipedia, but it could have been Wikipedia. The answer to that problem in terms of reputation is provide that information on your own site, optimize that information, that page. It will then rank for that specific query, and it will probably appear in the knowledge panel, which gives you control. So reputation in the knowledge panel becomes incredibly important, especially now in the knowledge panel. Not only do you have the facts, but you have what I call entity statements, which are basically questions people ask with the answer in the knowledge panel on the right-hand side, and that is presented as fact by Google. So if somebody says, or one of the questions that Google is showing in that knowledge panel is, for example, let's think of a company, is the SNCF legitimate? If I let somebody else answer that question, that will appear and it could potentially be negative. If I answer the question on my own site, I give myself a very good chance of getting that answer, my answer, in my own knowledge panel, controlling it and not having that reputation problem.
You know, at the knowledge panel, at the bottom there, they list sometimes your competitors.
Yeah.
Can you get rid of that? Should you be getting rid of that?
You can't get rid of it. You can influence it indirectly. It's really tricky. The problem with that is it's based on multiple things, one of which is user activity. Once Google starts showing them on your brand SERP underneath your knowledge panel, if users are clicking on them, if users are interested, Google will tend to leave them. The second is, if Google sees a close relationship that it thinks is significant and valuable and relevant, it will keep showing those related entities. So that in those two cases, you're really struggling to get rid of them. You need to demonstrate to Google that another entity is more closely related to you than the entity it's currently showing. And that is very difficult to do. But if you look at it the other way around, if your competitors are showing on your brand SERP, you presumably can easily show on their brand SERP. And from Google's perspective, that's really logical. It's saying, here's a company, you search for Kalicube, and it will show you equivalent companies that it thinks you would be interested in. That's a good experience for the user, not a good experience for you as a marketer. But what you can then do is say, well, if, for example, SE ranking are showing on the Kalicube people also search for, potentially I can show on SE rankings, and I can leverage from SE ranking to me just as much as they can leverage from me to them. And if I'm smart, I can really take advantage of it by doing a better job or a great job to valorize my brand in their SERP, which is, I would argue, an opportunity, not a loss.
Another question, so backwards a bit. So
let's backtrack.
Yeah, backtrack. So people often start thinking about their reputation when they really have lots of problems already.
More fool they.
Yeah. Huh? Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. But maybe they should prepare in advance, especially big companies, some corporations. Is there any way you can prepare for possible negative feedback in the future, for possible negative attack? So what can they do in terms of their knowledge panel, knowledge graph, what Google knows about them, to be strong enough to withstand better if they meet any consequences in the future?
Right, well, this is what I was talking about with proactive online reputation management. And I actually don't really like the term online reputation management, but what I do like is saying it's up to us all today to take control of our own brand message that Google transmits to our users, our audience, who are it's Google's users. So if you consider that Google is projecting what it thinks is our correct brand message to its users, then we need to make sure that Google's correctly understood it. And we should start today. We shouldn't wait until there's a problem, because when there's a problem, it's really difficult to deal with. You would expect, with bad results coming up on your brand SERP, you would expect 6 months of work to get rid of it completely. But if you've spent 2 years gently, easily, simply building up what I would call a buffer, page 1, page 2, page 3, totally controlled, totally great for you, it's very difficult for that negative content to push through this incredibly representative layer. And the other point is that if you have managed to fix in Google's mind who you are, what you do, who your audience is, and that you're trustworthy and you're a good company who serves their clients, it doesn't have the motivation to push that negative content up onto page 1 because it doesn't represent you, because you have convinced Google, you've educated Google about how great you are. You've made sure that it's got that balanced message, understanding who you are, what you do, who your audience is, and that you're credible. So from Google's perspective, if one piece of bad information turns up, it will ignore it. If it has enough solid information that proves that you are authoritative and credible for its users. So that buffer is not only a buffer of results, page 1, page 2, page 3 on the brand SERP, it's also a buffer of confidence that Google has in your good name. It's up to you to build up the buffer, physical buffer on the brand SERP and the psychological buffer of Google's incredible confidence in your glory.
And how do you do that? How do you build that?
Good digital marketing.
Yeah, but where to start? So here I am, I have a company. What do I do? So where do I begin?
Well, you start at home. You start on your own website. You start by thinking, what are the things I need to communicate to Google? And you start by communicating them to Google on your website. So you make sure that every piece of information, every part of your brand message is communicated clearly, concisely, and intelligently on your own website. And then you build out from there.
Should I do that on every page, or should I pick only one page for that?
Well, it depends. I mean, I would advise you need an about page. That about page needs to state who you are, what you do, who your audience is. Then you need a page, let's say, for reviews that states why your customers are so happy with you. Then maybe another page that says in the press, where you show all the press that you've had, this glorious press, and you point out to it and you show Google, you say, look, they're talking about me, they're talking about me, they're talking about me, I am credible, I am authoritative. So it depends on the company, but you need to build a series of pages, preferably in one silo, that really explain to Google and convince Google, once again, who you are, what you do, who your audience is, and why you're credible, why you're a credible, trustworthy solution for its users. If you can do that, you've given it the baseline, you've given it, this is the basic message I have, and then you can build on it by pushing corroboration, and corroboration is for everything on any other sites, all other sites that are authoritative around you. So it's building out from your own website this self-fulfilling perpetuation of the message that you're giving on your own website. Incredibly powerful, and a really good trick if you want it and you want to know what is the priority. The priority is whatever's appearing on your brand SERP in order. You go through it in order. It's really simple. Whatever's at the top is considered to be most important to Google. Your homepage, sort it out. Your site links, sort them out. Your social profiles, sort them out. Crunchbase, sort it out.
Do you have that in Kalicube.pro?
Yeah.
In your tool? So how it's organized in your tool?
Well, we have two sides, one of which is the knowledge panel, one of which is the brand SERP. The brand SERP side just goes through the brand SERP line by line and says, do this, do that, do that, do that, and you just do it in order.
So someone who needs to organize that properly, they can use your tool, Kalicube.pro. They can see the URL on the screen and they can go there, and it's basically the checklist of what they need to do, right?
Exactly.
So it's the full checklist. So if they go in, sign up, they will have the full checklist of what they need to do themselves.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because a lot of people tell me, I don't need Kalicube, I can do it myself, which is true. I can just look at my brand SERP and I can go through it and do them one by one, which is fine. Same thing for the knowledge panel. Getting a knowledge panel, it's a 3-step process. It isn't very complicated, takes a lot of work. But yes, you can all do it yourselves, that's fine. And I'm not hiding anything, I'm not kind of keeping my secrets to myself. The power of Kalicube is to make it faster, more efficient, easier, and more effective for you. Because what we do is then say, right, we're going to organize it for you, so you can actually just use Kalicube and you can keep track of what you've done, what you haven't done. And then we're going to track both your brand SERP and your knowledge panel and your presence in the knowledge graph over time, so you can measure how well you're doing. So with the buffer I was talking about earlier on, for example, we can show you now have a 3-page buffer, you have a 2-page buffer, you have half a page buffer. So we can, it's not only organizing your work, it's providing measurement and tracking that you can then report with, and you can reassure yourself with, and it is also an early warning system, because what happens when your 3-page buffer suddenly becomes a 2.5-page buffer? You've got a problem on the horizon. Sort it out now before it hits page 1. Because these things creep up. So you just need to keep an eye on it, and that's what Kalicube does.
So we don't need to talk about this whole checklist. There's no point in it, because it's kind of a routine that one can easily access in Kalicube.pro. But we'll talk about something else, for example, about Schema. What's the role of Schema in maintaining your online reputation in terms of knowledge graph and knowledge panel?
Schema is, I like to suggest, a lot of people look at Schema and think it's just a way to get the pretty features in SERPs. That's fine. But that is really only the tip of the iceberg. It's the cherry on the cake. It's the icing. The cake itself, which is Schema Markup, what it does is it explains to Google what it is you're trying to communicate in any given page in Google's native language. So it's taking the content of the page and wrapping it up or reiterating it in Google's native language. Now, why is that important? Because Google's probably understood what's in your page. Google's pretty smart. Let's say it's 40% confident. You add Schema Markup, you're adding a reiteration of what you've already said in the page that Google's already understood, and that reiteration in its native language that it can digest natively will boost its confidence, let's say, to 70%. And confidence is incredibly important for knowledge panels, for the knowledge graph, for brand SERPs, and for any SEO. If Google is confident in anything, it will rank. And so in this context, what we're using Schema for is to boost Google's confidence in its understanding and potentially give it details that we didn't necessarily say in the page. The other incredible powerful thing about Schema Markup, and as you can see, I'm getting into the big chunky cake, the cherry, which was the nice elements on the SERPs, the rich elements on the SERPs, is not the main aim. Because what we can do with Schema Markup is every time we say something, and we were talking earlier on about stating facts like revenue, reviews, who I am, who the CEO is, whatever it might be, you can point using sameAs to all the corroborative sources that prove what you're saying. And once again, confidence. Now what we have is, without Schema we were 40% confident. With Schema we become 70% confident because Google has seen a reiteration in a language it understands natively. Then we point out to the corroboration, it says, oh, and all these third parties say the same thing. We've now got to 95% confidence. Google is incredibly confident in what that page contains and what you're trying to communicate with the content in that page. That goes for your about page, your reviews page, the CEO page, the board page, but any page which you're doing SEO on. Building Google's confidence is absolutely key throughout SEO, and not just on brand SERPs and knowledge panels.
Building a PR, strong PR around your company is inevitable in case when you are trying to manage your reputation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people go into this and say, right, I've got a reputation problem, so I need some PR, and they start from that aspect. I say, get your PR to boost Google's confidence in its understanding of you, and in fact, that PR, proactive, preemptive PR, is going to save you the effort down the line when any kind of problem does appear. And the other thing about PR, it's not just about reputation management, it's also about the knowledge graph and Google's understanding of us in the knowledge graph. What happens with the knowledge graph confidence score? If you've ever looked at Kalicube.pro, the free tool, you can look up in the knowledge graph using the API from Google whether an entity is in the knowledge graph or not, and what confidence Google has. Now, what tends to happen is you will get this you'll get the presence in the knowledge graph, you'll build up a confidence score, let's say of 1,000. Which is a good score. That's based on the information you have provided and the corroborative sources you've indicated. To boost beyond that 1,000 takes PR, news, coverage, recent events, recent things that are being talked about on authoritative expert sites within your niche. So the PR is necessary just to build up the knowledge graph presence. It also plays off into the proactive ORM we were talking about earlier on. It also helps you PR, brings in new clients. It's a win-win-win-win-win situation.
You were talking about that you need good reputable sources for that. How do I pick them up and how that's different from building backlinks?
I personally don't particularly like building backlinks. I don't think it's something we need to do. Mentions are fine. The point about all of this is, if I mentioned a press section earlier on, you don't need a backlink from The Guardian or The Times or The New York Times. You can actually just have it on your press page and point to it using sameAs or a link, or direct link, to them, say, yes, that is about us. And that's absolutely fine. That helps Google to understand that this article is actually about us. We can corroborate it ourselves. So getting a link back from them is not actually necessary, from a Google perspective at least. Beyond that, the idea of PR is aiming at the right targets, and the right targets in PR are the ones that are most relevant to your audience. Now, what we do at Kalicube.pro is we will take what we call equivalent entities. We will take 100 equivalent entities. An equivalent entity is an entity, same type of entity, a person, a brand, a podcast, a music album, a product, that's in the same geo-region and in the same industry. And we take those and we analyse them and we find what is ranking on the brand SERPs, what is appearing in the knowledge panels, and then we can identify which of the sources Google is looking at, which are the sources that Google is promoting, prioritising within that industry. And once again, industry, geo, entity type. That's when you get the valuable information. We had a client who was an NFL player in America, and they needed news. They needed some news to boost his visibility, his career. And they asked me, they gave me 100 NFL players. We pushed them all into the Kalicube system, and we came up with the top news sites, the top video sites, the top social sites. And they could then go to the news sites and they could pitch their PR to the top 5 news sites for that industry, that entity type in that country, i.e. an NFL player in America. What that meant is that they only had to pitch 5 companies to get the news, to get the 3 pieces of news they needed to boost his career, instead of the 20 they usually had to aim for, because we could prioritize it, because we knew which news outlets ranked within this industry for that entity type in that geo region, and we could tell them this is the order of importance, this is the order of priority, this is the order that Google is looking at from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which is, in my opinion, immeasurably useful, because you know you're aiming at the right targets when you do your PR outreach.
Yeah, that's good. That works. So, question from me personally.
I like Kalicube.
Yeah, I like Kalicube too. I recommend anyone who's listening to go and sign up for Kalicube, because it's the best tool you'll ever find.
Oh, I'll go and do that now.
What I wanted to ask you personally from myself, I'm often seeing people spamming with the sameAs attribute in the schema markup, mention sameAs, and they have thousands sometimes.
Right.
So,
I can tell you a couple of things about that. It's totally counterproductive. Using mentions, no's, whatever it might be, you can think, oh, I'll just put as much in there as I can. But what you end up doing is throwing so many entities at Google that it doesn't make any sense anymore. You need to, for mentions, for example, I would say between 4, 6, maybe 8 tops mentions, because you don't want to disperse the message too much. What are the 8, maximum 8, 4 to 8 entities that actually matter to this page? What are the 8 entities that identify the topic of this page, what we're talking about, and the validity of what we're saying? And the spamming of the sameAs, I can give you a direct example of that. I know somebody who spammed sameAs, who pointed to all these different sources thinking this is absolutely brilliant. They lost their knowledge panel. Why? Because they were pointing to too many sources that didn't make sense, didn't corroborate, and or weren't authoritative. So they thought, if I throw all of this information at Google, Google will figure it out. And what Google actually does is say, I'm not sure anymore. And what I mean, if we look at Google as a child, which I do a lot, and we'll probably talk about that later, when a child isn't sure, it stops talking. When Google isn't sure, when Google isn't confident, it says, I better not say anything because I'm not sure anymore. So it disappears. Confidence is so important. And if you just throw everything at it, you're going to break that confidence because you're throwing so much confusing, contradictory information at it, it'll just get lost like a child. That's not how you educate.
Do you know how the hill is called where we are filming this?
That's a very good point. It's called Hill of the Child, Child Hill.
Yeah.
So, in fact, we are standing on Google. Google is a child. We are the responsible adults in the room. We need to educate Google. And today, in Kiev, standing on Child Hill, we are standing on Google. Wow! Isn't that cool? I love that.
This confidence score, how is it measured? Is there any way you can measure it?
We're working on a score within Kalicube, which is going to measure, we've got a control score and a quality score for the brand SERP. And I was initially using Google's API confidence score to measure presence in the knowledge graph, but there are multiple problems with that, which is that not all knowledge panels are triggered by the main knowledge graph. Therefore, I can't measure the confidence score for different verticals with knowledge graphs, which means that my score doesn't mean anything outside of that specific area. The other is that, as I said earlier, once you've got to a certain level, it's news that's going to make that confidence score go up. And news actually isn't a measure of understanding or confidence and understanding, it's a measure of getting overexcited about this particular entity. I use the Beatles as a measurement stick. And what I saw was that, for example, John Lennon had a confidence score that was fairly flat. And then in January 2021, it went right up. It absolutely shot up. What had happened? In December 2020 was the anniversary of his death. So there was absolutely loads of news about him. So the confidence score in the knowledge graph went up. But in terms of what we're actually trying to do pragmatically and practically at Kalicube, that actually isn't a helpful measurement in and of itself. We need other things to come into play. So we're actually building a score that will measure both Google's explicit understanding that it's showing through its API, but also the knowledge panel, what's being shown there, the quality of the knowledge, the brand SERP, the control of that brand SERP, to bring it all together into one score that says Google understands who you are, what you do, who your audience is. It's incredibly confident, and you are now able to start controlling what Google is showing your audience when they Google your brand name, which is where Kalicube is going from beginning to end. It's saying, take back control. You're the responsible adult. Educate Google. Tell Google what you want it to show. If what you want it to show is an honest representation of your brand or your person, Google will show it. It has no reason to show anything else.
Is the confidence score somehow related to trust or correlated to trust? So can you measure the trust somehow with anything, with any tool or with any score, or make some assumptions about that? Can there be any correlation?
Well, I think this isn't a question I've really dug into, but it's a really interesting question from that perspective, because from my perspective, I'm looking at basically all of SEO is based on three things. It's getting Google to understand what it is you're offering and being confident in that understanding, making sure that it thinks you're a credible solution, which is the credibility, expertise, authority, and trust, which is the second one. And thirdly, providing the content to Google in the format that is relevant for Google's SERP or Google's usage for its users, be it on SERP or off SERP. So those are the three things you're looking at, and the three things would need to be measured separately. Understanding and confidence in that understanding, credibility, expertise, authority, and trust, and deliverability, usability for Google. Suitability is the correct word, I do apologize. The suitability of what it is you're offering for Google's product, which is its SERP. The suitability of what you're offering for Google's users when users are searching for whatever term it might be. So if we come back, well, that's general SEO advice. If we come back to what we're talking about, we're saying understanding, confidence in that understanding, credibility, expertise, authority, and trust. And the third one is actually is Google on my brand SERP delivering my brand message as I wrote it? And I think that's an important point, is a lot of companies spend thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars creating a brand image and a brand message, and then don't bother or don't think to make sure that their brand message is reflected in their brand SERP, which is foolish beyond belief, because that brand SERP is something their audience will see at some point in their journey, and once they're a client, they will see it multiple times, potentially per day, when they're searching to navigate to the site. So making sure that your brand message is being reflected in your brand SERP is phenomenally important, vastly overlooked, and is the third aspect of understanding, credibility, and representation.
So you've mentioned that there are several verticals in the knowledge graph. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well,
I think it's somehow a new concept for people. They didn't know about knowledge graph so much, and now it appears there are like several knowledge graphs actually.
yeah, which is actually logical. I mean, if you look at Microsoft, I think there's probably only one real knowledge graph. I mean, there are presumably other ones, but they're really focusing on that one big one, which is why I think Bing are probably slightly better with their focused knowledge graph, because they're not dispersing their focus. Now, what I had noticed is that the main knowledge graph, what I will call, let's call it the knowledge vault, which is the one the API plugs into, that's the big daddy of them all. It's where Google is going. It's trying to fill this up with information. But it has multiple other data sources, more or less curated, that also contain knowledge and also have knowledge graph KGM IDs. And that would be Google Scholars, Google Books, Google Podcasts, Google Maps, and the web index actually has a knowledge graph built into it. And each one of these is in a silo. It's several vertical knowledge graphs that don't communicate between each other. And that means that, from my perspective, and this is a guess, but I'm pretty confident it's the correct guess, Google is taking all these knowledge graphs, including Google My Business, and moving them little by little into the main knowledge graph so that it has one global source of information that it can refer to, entities, relationships, attributes. That is where Google is going. And that is where Kalicube is driving our clients, is saying, if you're in the books vertical, we're going to gradually move you and your books from that books vertical into the main knowledge graph, because that is where the power lies. That is where you're going to get your return on investment.
In terms of all that said, what can be the KPI for anyone who is trying to work on their online reputation with and working with knowledge graph at the same time? So how can they measure if they are effective or not, if they are doing the right thing or not? What can be the KPI?
Right, well, I think online reputation without the concept of controlling the brand SERP and the knowledge panel is short term. I would even say meaningless, in the sense that if you're just saying, I'm trying to drown this bad content, get rid of it all, make sure that it's kind of pretty enough to get going with, but you don't look at the underlying problems, you don't look at the overall situation, your overall digital ecosystem, then you're making a big mistake, because it's going to keep coming back, and you're not building on Google's understanding, which is the foundation of everything that's to come in entity-based SEO and entity-based search. Now, in terms of KPI, that's exactly what we're working on at Kalicube. We have a set of measurements, the quality, the control of your brand SERP. We have a measurement for the knowledge panel, and we're building a measurement for Google's confidence in its understanding, as I said earlier on. So we're going to have 4 or 5 different measurements that allow you to then track your progress, track that you're actually moving forwards. But the fundamental thing you want to be able to boast is that you control what Google understands about you, that Google trusts you as a source. Now, I'll give you one really great example. The day that Google uses the description from your own site in your knowledge panel and does it consistently is the day that Google trusts you to provide information about yourself, and that's the day you're really starting to win the war.
Imagine I have a company, a well-established one, and it has a website and it has some backlinks and it has lots of information, but it doesn't have knowledge panel. How do I make knowledge panel to appear for them? Because it might be very important for some companies for different reasons. How do I trigger the knowledge panel?
If your company or yourself, you think you should have a knowledge panel, but you don't. The problem Google is having is what John Mueller from Google calls reconciliation. Reconciliation is basically bringing that information together into one consistent whole that Google can actually make sense of and understand and be confident in its understanding. If we look at that as a plate, a china plate, Google has lots of fragments of this china plate that it's found all around the web, and it's trying to piece them together into the full plate, and it can't do it. It doesn't know how the puzzle fits together. It doesn't have a reference. So what you need to do is give it a reference. You need to give it that plate, the puzzle, all put together correctly, with all the right pieces in all the right places. And that involves creating that plate on your site, on the About page on your site. You create the plate, you say who we are, what we do, who our audience is. You give it the CV of the company, the CV of the person, and you say this is the complete plate. Then Google can take these pieces and it can say, I've put it all together and it makes sense. Okay, here we go. And if it was almost there, if it had almost got that plate right, you will trigger a knowledge panel pretty quickly in a couple of weeks. If it was quite a long way away and it hadn't been able to piece it together at all, or it had some bad pieces in, some pieces that aren't actually you, or it had got the pieces in the wrong place, or it didn't have the sticky glue that stuck it all together correctly and it was all floppy and falling apart, then it will take something like 3 months, because Google needs to actually reconstitute that puzzle and put it all back together again. So the steps are very simple. It's saying all the information is out there. I need to show Google how it all fits together. If I can show Google how it fits together, Google has a comparison to how it has fitted it together. Once it can fit it together and it's confident that it's fitted it together correctly, you will trigger a knowledge panel.
So if it's not triggered, how do I find out that it's incorrect? How do I debug?
Right, well, once again, if you think it should trigger but it hasn't triggered, it's probably that there are some bad pieces, incorrect pieces. For example, if it's found a fragment over here, let's say on Wikidata or on Crunchbase, and the fragment is the wrong shape because it's incorrect, the information is incorrect, it will be trying to fit this piece in and it won't fit into the puzzle. So what you need to do is go and correct the source, Wikidata, Crunchbase, whatever it might be, so that the piece correctly fits into the puzzle. And once you do that, Google has this full plate. So until you can get that full plate for Google, you will have a lot of trouble triggering that knowledge panel. Now, next question I'm sure you're going to ask is, how do we know which sources to look at, which are the pieces that don't fit? And this is where Kalicube.pro comes in, is that we look around the web and we look at what Google is looking at for you specifically, and we can prioritize which of these sources Google sees as the most important, so we can prioritize which are the ones you need to correct. Once you have corrected those important pieces of information that Google already has, the fragmented plate, and it can kind of put it together and it's kind of happy, if you're still not triggering a knowledge panel, then we can find the other sources where you are not present within your industry, for your geo region, for your entity type, where you need to place the information. And once you've got that, then I like to say it isn't a question of can you trigger a knowledge panel, it's how long does it take, how much effort does it take. And as long as you're aiming at the right pieces, correcting the right pieces, or if the piece doesn't exist in the case of this industry level question, you create the piece so that Google can fit it into the puzzle. And as long as you're doing that, there isn't a concept of notability here. Google isn't saying they deserve it or they don't deserve it. Google just wants to understand. And if Google can understand, it will trigger a knowledge panel. Now the next question along is, will the knowledge panel trigger when somebody searches your brand name? And that's a different question. The fact that it doesn't trigger when somebody searches your brand name does not necessarily mean that that knowledge panel does not exist. If you don't find it but you think it does exist, try typing about brand name or about person name. That will tend to encourage Google to trigger the knowledge panel. And if that doesn't work, then you can also use Kalicube.pro. With Kalicube.pro, we have means to find what I call sprouts, which are the tiny little knowledge panels that just have the company name or the person's name, but you can't find in a brand SERP because Google won't show these sprouts because they don't contain enough information. Bill Slawski writes about how Google decides to trigger a knowledge panel in a specific SERP. And a big part of that is, do we have enough reliable information to trigger the knowledge panel, yes or no? And if they don't have enough information to fill a knowledge panel, and knowledge panels are judged in terms of enough information according to industry and entity type. So Google knows how much information it wants. For example, for an American footballer in the US, it wants this much. For an author, it maybe only wants that much. So within each industry, we also need to build knowledge panel templates to understand how much information Google needs in order to want to show this knowledge panel to people. And I'll come back to the China plate idea as well, because the analogy of a child is really, really useful here, because Google needs to believe that you are telling the truth with your entity home, with your China plate. And when you have that China plate whole, you've explained to Google, much like a parent explains to a child, then the child goes and asks the baker, the policewoman, the headmaster, the teacher. And if all of those people are saying contradictory things or aren't explaining it in the same way as the parent, the child will be unconfident about that information and won't really believe it. Google is the same. It needs all of these corroborative sources to repeat the information in much the same way you are giving it on your own site. And they don't all have to give all the information. Each of them can give a little bit of information or parts of the information, some of the information. Doesn't matter, because you've given it the plate to which it can compare it. You are the parent who can re-explain what everybody else has said. So we've got two analogies, the broken plate and the child. And for the child, the equivalent of the broken piece of puzzle, the piece of puzzle that doesn't fit, is if the teacher is saying something different. And if you can correct that piece of information, the child, Google, will become confident that what you have told it to start with is true, is reliable, is factual, and it can, I like to say, go and shout about it in the playground.
Behind you, it's the Museum of Ukrainian History.
Whee!
Hence the question I'm going to ask you. There is a popular belief that if you are not popular enough, you will not trigger knowledge panel, whatever you do. Is that true?
No.
So
Very simply.
You don't have to be popular at all?
No. Well, everybody kind of assumes that Google's a pseudo Wikipedia, which is foolish. Wikipedia has a concept of notability. And the idea for Wikipedia, and I agree with them, is what's the point of filling an encyclopedia for humans with people, entities, things, companies who aren't notable, who aren't interesting to people? If people aren't going to spontaneously search for a person, a company, a music group, whatever it might be, there's no real point in having them in a human searchable encyclopedia like Wikipedia. Google doesn't have that idea of notability because it doesn't have that problem. Google just wants to understand. Google is a child who wants to understand the whole world, and it doesn't have any particular judgment on any particular part of the world that it wants to understand more or less than another. It's just going to try to understand everything. So from that perspective, everybody can get a knowledge panel because everybody can be understood. And Google just wants to understand everybody, because by understanding everybody, it's much like it wants to crawl the whole web, because it wants to have the best opportunity, have all the information possible in order to give the best results to its users. So from that perspective, don't worry about notability in terms of being understood. Notability only then comes into play in terms of, is Google going to trigger a knowledge panel? And then that comes to the question of, when does Google trigger a knowledge panel when you search brand name? It will trigger a knowledge panel if it thinks that knowledge panel will be helpful and useful to the user, i.e. it fulfills the intent of the user. So an author in Britain would trigger a knowledge panel in Britain. They might not trigger a knowledge panel in America because the author is not known in America. So that difference is incredibly important, because for an American who doesn't know who that author is, having a knowledge panel would not be helpful and valuable to them, because their intent would not be the author, it would be somebody of the same name in America. Same for a company. Companies in America and the US have the same name, but they're different companies. So it would trigger, theoretically, the knowledge panel for the British company in Britain, the American company in America, and that is good user experience because Google is hoping, expecting, and wanting to fulfill the user's intent. And the user's intent is often geo-local. The second aspect of knowledge panels is a knowledge panel can appear and then disappear, and that would imply that user interaction hasn't been sufficiently high, which indicates users are not actually very interested in this entity, the knowledge panel. And Google will put it away. It uses user interaction in the form of clicks, particularly, to decide whether or not to keep a knowledge panel. The last one is ambiguity. And this is where we come into the idea of dominant entities. Because if you have multiple entities with the same name, Google's trying to think, which one shall I show? I don't know which one they mean with the particular brand name or the person's name. And then it will show a knowledge panel with see results about for the other entities. How does it decide which one gets the knowledge panel, which one gets the see results about, and which one maybe doesn't show at all? It's by dominance of that entity. And the dominance comes from notability, confidence, and newsworthiness.
We were talking about ambiguity, and maybe you have seen examples when another company has a very similar name to my company, and my knowledge panel has information from that company instead of my company.
Right.
How can I tell to Google that this is not my company? So I've already told about myself. How do I tell them it is not me? So the other case around.
There's a really, really problematic situation where it's actually not possible in schema markup to say this isn't what it is. You can only say this is what it is. However, in Wikidata, if you have a Wikidata entry, there is a way to say this isn't the same as the other one, a disambiguation, which I've used a couple of times with great success. The other thing, if you don't have a Wikidata entry and basically you need to have both entities with a Wikidata entry and then say this is not the same as this to disambiguate. So if the information that Google has got wrong is information from another company that your company also has, for example, revenue, if it's taking the revenue from the other company and attributing it to yours, what you would want to do is take your entity home that we discussed earlier on and explicitly tell Google what your revenue is. Now that's a really good solid signal if you have the entity home or if you're building an entity home. If you're really early in the stage and you haven't really got your entity home sorted out, the best way to do it is a site like Crunchbase, which shows specific information about the different companies. Create an entry for each of them, make that information explicit in both of them, and make sure, and this is interesting for companies and for people, the date of creation of the company is the equivalent of somebody's birth date. The place of creation of a company is the equivalent of somebody's place of birth. And that is the most important piece of disambiguating information you can find because it's permanent. Google is looking for information that's permanent on which to foundationize, let's say, the rest of the information. So for a person to disambiguate between two people, there are lots of Jason Barnards in the world. There are lots of Jason Barnards in the UK. There's only one Jason Barnard born on the 5th of June 1966 in Leeds in the UK. That is a permanent piece of information that can never change, that Google can rely on, and Google does rely on, in order to disambiguate. And it's the same for companies. The name of the company, the date it was created, the place it was created are things that never change. Whereas, for example, the head office will change frequently. Where I live will change frequently. So you want to make sure that you've really got solid in Google's brain those pieces of fundamental information that never can change, that are permanent pieces of information. Once you have that, you can start building the other information on top much more easily. So in our example, it will be saying, if I'm going to state what the revenue is on Crunchbase, I have to make sure that accompanying information is name of company, revenue, date of creation, place of creation, because that disambiguates for Google.
And you mentioned also that you can trigger knowledge panel in one country, but it will not be shown, maybe not shown in another country. What should an international company or a person who wants to have international coverage do in that terms to make sure they are shown as often as possible?
Well, for an international company that actually has an international presence, that isn't a big problem because
well, like
Google...
they have a head office in one country, but they want to have access to clients in other countries.
Sure. Sorry, if it's an international brand that's recognised around the world, it will probably trigger. That's a question of notability. Same for a person. If you want to have a knowledge panel trigger in every country, even though you don't necessarily have a presence in that country, you need to make sure that the probability that somebody is searching for you is reasonably high, or at least higher than the entities with the same name in that geo region. And that requires notability. So here we do have that concept of notability. In terms of understanding who you are, Google doesn't care about notability. In terms of triggering a knowledge panel, notability plays a great role because notability implies importance for the user and the probability that that user is looking for you and not one of the other entities with the same name.
How do we measure notability?
Very difficult to do. That is one place where the confidence score in the knowledge graph API does come into play, i.e. the notability, the confidence score would indicate importance, newsworthiness, notability, whatever you want to call it. So that would be a place where you would think that would be a good idea to build up that confidence score in the knowledge graph because that will increase the probability of the knowledge panel triggering every single time.
And is there any way, except for news, to become more notable?
PR. You need news, you need recent news. I had a really interesting example. Google's knowledge graph updates regularly. And at Kalicube we track when it updates, the days it updates. And the biggest update we've seen so far was in 2019. I called it the Budapest update. And it was massive, absolutely massive. It changed so much in the knowledge graph. We were tracking it at the time, and since then we have never seen anything quite so phenomenally large. And what was interesting there is I looked into entities that I felt were equivalent to look at how that confidence score changed. Now, Marilyn Monroe is still famous, is still newsworthy, is still talked about a great deal. And her confidence score went right up. She was in a film with Montgomery Clift, who at the time was just as famous as Marilyn Monroe, but today most people have forgotten him, or a lot of people have forgotten him. His score went right down. There wasn't any recent news about him. No authoritative recent news talking about him. So the knowledge graph is incredibly sensitive to the newsworthiness. And we mentioned John Lennon earlier on. John Lennon's anniversary of John Lennon's death in December 2020 caused his confidence score to go right up. Obviously, he will always trigger, so there isn't a question of whether or not John Lennon's knowledge panel will trigger. But in the case of ambiguity, where you have that problem, this is a great example of how you can get that to work.
So do you need to appear on the resources that appear in their turn on Google News tab?
Yes and no. News is phenomenally important, of course, but once again at Kalicube.pro we've got this to an art. It's not just news, it's videos, it's interviews, it's articles about you on blogs, it's authoritative niche interviews would be just as good as a BBC article if it's truly niche, if it's truly authoritative. And so what we do at Kalicube.pro is once again identify these sources by geo, entity type, industry. And it goes from the social buzz around the entity, to news around the entity, to videos around the entity. Events are incredibly important. If the entity is involved sponsoring or part of or speaking at an event or multiple events, that tends to be something that really builds Google's confidence because it understands events. Because of COVID, Google has got built up very, very quickly its understanding of events because it needed to be able to say this has been cancelled, this has been delayed, this has been pushed back. So events are a very powerful source of information for Google on which it can build that knowledge. So don't just think about news, think about niche blogs, think about videos, think about events. Think about books, maybe. There are an awful lot of different places that Google can get this notability signal from. Make the most of all of them.
Okay, thank you. So, Jason, where can people find more information about you, where they can connect and follow you? What are the best places for them to do that?
Well, I'm the brand SERP guy, which I didn't say right at the beginning. The idea of my job is that if you search my name, it tells my life story. It tells you who I am, what I do, who my audience is, and it gives you the choice of where you want to connect with me. So what I've done and what we should all be doing with our personal brand SERP or our company brand SERP is building up our brand SERP to represent where we are, where we can be found, where we engage with our audience. So if you look at my brand SERP, first is my site. Come and visit my site, you learn lots about me. Second is going to be Twitter. I love Twitter, that's why it ranks up there near the top. Then LinkedIn, then my company site, Kalicube. So Google is showing you a prioritized list, in my mind, of where I like to be interacted with, but it gives my users the choice of how they want to interact with me. My site, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, my company site. It's up to you.
So if someone signs up for Kalicube.pro and has some difficulties, do you have the done-for-you service to help them out and sort it on the online reputation?
We do some client work. We don't do a great deal. Our aim is to focus on building the tool, building our understanding, building out a series of techniques and strategies that allow us to control the brand SERP and the knowledge panel, and get agencies on board so that agencies can serve the clients directly, and we can really focus on helping those agencies help their clients. That's the ideal circumstance for me, because I think the value that I can bring and Kalicube can bring is understanding, experimentation, to get to the bottom of how we educate Google about who we are, what we do, who our audience is, and why we would be a credible solution for its users.